Okay, so I want to thank everyone for coming today to our Summit for Action and Civic Reform. If you were at the first session, then all of this is going to be a repeat, so just hang in there. If you're new, welcome. I'm really excited to share this wonderful lineup of speakers on this very relevant topic where I think a lot of us have legitimate questions that we're excited to get answered. So this session is going to be about how nonprofits are recovering and getting paid, or in some cases not getting paid, after the end of the budget impasse and the bill backlog that sort of continues to be an issue. We want to thank our event underwriters for this program. That's all included in your program, that's in your hands. Also, Wi-Fi login information on ICPR, everything you could ever want to know is in that program. We are live streaming today's discussion on our Facebook page and we'll be tweeting. Please do an event evaluation card if you haven't yet. And we'll be doing another audience Q&A at the end of this session, so please try to keep your questions to 1 to 2 sentences, and that's few commas in your sentence. Keep them short and succinct, and we're going to get through as many questions as we can. Without further ado, I want to invite our moderator, Anita, to come up. She's the Director of Public Policy at Forefront, which I'm sure she'll talk about. Welcome, Anita.
Thank you, Sarah. So, good afternoon, everyone. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Anita Banerjee, and I'm the new Director of Public Policy at Forefront. We are formerly the Donors Forum, which many of you may be familiar with. Forefront is Illinois' hub for social good. We are the only membership association in the country that welcomes both nonprofits and grant makers, as well as public agencies, advisors, and sector allies. We provide education, training, advocacy, thought leadership, and help facilitate action around issues that are important to our members and what we call the greater social impact sector. So as moderator of this afternoon session, I want to take a few minutes to reflect on the nonprofit sector and its magnitude. As state budget wars rage on an annual basis, it often feels like the nonprofit organizations that play a crucial economic role across our state are left scrambling to make ends meet. As job creators and builders of human and cultural capital, they are the pillars of our communities. In particular, these past 2 years, nonprofits in Illinois have been forced to do more with less, stretching their dollars thin as possible to continue to meet the needs of the people they serve. Our most vulnerable communities across Illinois have been constant victims of the state budget. And now, with the immense backlog of unpaid bills, this does not ensure payment of services in a timely manner. As you know, nonprofits serve the vital interests of every person in every community across our state. They employ more than 500,000 people. And according to an American Community Survey, during the period of 2007 to 2011, these groups were a major economic engine for Illinois. And it was noted during this period that nearly 14,000 nonprofit organizations employed 9% of the state's workforce, which represents nearly $20 billion in combined payroll. All this information is documented on Forefront's buildingastrongerillinois.com, a website. And I wanted to make mention of a fact sheet that the Responsible Budget Coalition put together recently. This spring, they put together this document that is up in front that you can grab if you'd like, that has specific impacts that are detailed regarding our communities, which includes 1 million Illinoisans losing critical services during the impasse, not to mention the rise in community violence and the loss of access to services for nearly 100,000 immigrants in Illinois. So this afternoon, we have a bona fide group of panelists to share remarks regarding the long-term effects from the state budget impasse. Let's take a minute to meet these individuals. So we'll have the panelists share who they are, tell a little bit about their organizations or their office, and then maybe give a brief comment or two about the issue at hand before we delve into the questions.
Okay, I'll start. It's good to feel bona fide. My name is Wendy DuBois. I'm the president and CEO of United Way of Metropolitan Chicago. United Way is actually the largest private funder of human services across the state of Illinois. I'm joined here actually by my colleagues Jack Kaplan and Marilyn Jackson in the back. I'm thrilled to be on this panel discussing a topic that's very near and dear to our heart. It's an understatement to say that this has been a difficult time for nonprofits. I would say there's been enormous turmoil and uncertainty with the stalemate, with the impasse, and equally as important, receding funds for human services. In fact, I would go as far as to say we've left a pillar of our society, as you called it, anemic. We see our role as a champion for the people in need of service, for agency partners, and for the human services infrastructure overall. We are a neutral, nonpartisan voice, and so we've used that voice to publish surveys over the past 2 years to document what's been happening to people and services in the state of Illinois. We've also organized media and outreach across sectors, corporate, community, labor, civic organizations. We've seen people lose vital services, programs get cut and shuttered, and the agency's in an extremely precarious financial condition. And I think I would just add to what you said that we see this as more than a loss for services of our most vulnerable populations. This is something that goes to the heart of the Illinois economy, because not funding social services costs the state longer in the long term, and it really, really holds back our growth and investment in the state. So we've got an economic problem through this.
Andrea?
Good afternoon. My name is Andrea Durbin. I'm the CEO of the Illinois Collaboration on Youth. We are the largest provider voice for children and youth at risk in the state of Illinois. And I also have been the chair of the Pay Now Illinois Coalition, which until recently was engaged in 2 active lawsuits against the state to seek payment for unpaid human services contracts. And that journey began shortly into the budget impasse, when we realized that the budget impasse wasn't going to be over by Labor Day or Thanksgiving or Christmas or any kind of signpost that we originally had. And we started talking to lawmakers, and we asked them, providers have these signed contracts and they're not getting paid, and they don't seem to have a way to get paid. What should they do about them? And many lawmakers were stunned to realize that the state had issued contracts in the first place. Then shortly into about 6 months or so into the impasse, I had a conversation with the former comptroller, and I asked her, what should providers do if we end this fiscal year without contracts? And she said, I don't know, and I've never thought about it. And I put that same question to Secretary Demas at the Illinois Department of Human Services a few weeks later, and he said, I don't want to think about it. I hope it doesn't come to that. And obviously that wasn't a good enough answer for the providers that we serve and the boards that govern them. And so the question, we went to court because we sought to answer this question, which was very unclear. Do we have a legal remedy to enforce these contracts, or do we only have a political solution? And that was not something that boards knew the answer to. Everyone was operating as if their contracts were enforceable, or I should say many organizations were. There were some, like our colleague down at the end of the table here, who around that same time took big steps to shut down programs and lay off staff, not trusting that they would be able to enforce these contracts. But for the most part, most providers assumed they would be paid, and we were like, I'm not sure you can bank on that. And unfortunately, we did get an answer from the courts, which was that we really did not have a way to enforce these contracts in the courts. We only had a political solution. But it took, that answer wasn't given to us until June of this year. So it took, the court time is different than human services time. Is that diplomatic? And it took that long to try to get to that answer, and honestly, if the budget impasse hadn't been resolved, we would have continued to press the issue up to the Illinois Supreme Court to try to push that a little bit further, but I don't want to take up more time except to say that I'll add to what Wendy said, which is that during this budget impasse, not only did we see thousands of jobs lost and clients go unserved, but we lost opportunities to invest or improve in our human service system. When providers are contorting themselves to try to make payroll and keep the doors open and figure out who's going to get laid off next, they are not able to engage in strategic planning, in program innovation, in thinking about meeting new needs that are out there. And so it's really destabilized our workforce. It's hurt the clients and families that we serve in ways that they may feel for years to come. And so it's been a very terrible experience for the human service sector as a whole.
Hi, I'm Illinois State Comptroller Susanna Mendoza, and Andrea, I'm so sorry. I feel like I'm on a constant apology tour for the behavior of this state with our, really most important network, the safety network for the people of the state of Illinois. I often say that I believe that the most important job of any government, regardless of parties, of who's in control of what, is to protect the most vulnerable people amongst us. And that was one of the key reasons why I ran to become Illinois Comptroller. And for anybody paying attention, I hope you agree that since taking office, I have not been sitting behind some desk, being quiet about what's happening in the state of Illinois. I have been fighting every single day, trying to be heard, not for myself, but because I see that the controller should, certainly during times of fiscal crisis, be a vessel for the voice of so many other people who don't feel that they have a voice, the people who seem to have been forgotten, the people who have been expendable during this budget impasse. And so every day, you talked about rationing, Wendy. I think you mentioned the word rationing. And people ask me, well, what's it like to be controller in the state of Illinois? As the state's chief fiscal and accountability officer, people think we have a budget, so where's my money? And I keep telling people, look, we have a budget, but we didn't win the lotto. We even lost the lotto for a few days. And there's still, up until now, that we're finally starting to see some revenues come in from the increase in the income tax. Prior to this week, we still haven't received money from that. But we are still in very much a rationing mode, a triage mode of sorts. The Illinois State Comptroller's Office, which is supposed to be the office that just pays the bills, has gone from being more of an accounting office to the state's main trauma center. And, it usually elicits a chuckle, but there is nothing funny about what's happening. So we've gone from being what should be a managerial office, somewhat of an accountant's office, to triaging the state's crisis. And when I heard the word rationing, it reminded me of how I feel that my job is sometimes. I feel like I'm like George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life, right? Where it's like, I know you're owed all this money, this is your money. But we can't give it all to you because otherwise we won't function as a state. Can you get by with just this? Will this keep the lights on? Will this keep the doors on? And I feel that I have like the most anemic breadstick. And there's like all these starving children. And I don't want any of them to die. But I can't give one of them a bigger chunk than the other one. They all get little crumbs, and it's not enough to like satisfy their hunger. It's not enough to give them any kind of vitamin boost. It does nothing other than keep them alive one more day. It is absolutely anemic, and it's not fair. So I'm gonna end by just saying this. I think everybody here at this table is in the same fight. I'm happy that you sued the state of Illinois. I think it's important for people to fight back. When I have to look at spending up to 12% interest payments on late payments, which have now added up to over $900 million of your money that are going to never be spent on a single human being, on investing on a single job creation program, and a school, and any kind of bricks and mortar, highway, roadway, nothing. It's all going to go to late payment interest penalties, over $900 million. We're well on our way to hitting the $1 billion mark. At the cost of $2 million a day, late payment interest penalties are racking up. $2 million a day. When you woke up this morning and brushed your teeth, we just burned another $2 million. Imagine what that kind of money could do to help social service providers, who are helping the most vulnerable people amongst us. So you're going to continue to hear me speak out a lot. You saw that the governor just agreed to do this $6 billion worth of bonding authorization that the legislature gave him. I'm glad he's finally doing it, but it shouldn't have taken 61 days to agree to do something that is just common sense. That's $120 million later. Blown. That will never be invested in Lutheran Social Services or United Way or anyone else. And so this is the frustration of being controller these days. People who love me ask me, why did I do it? But it's because I love helping people, and the people that are here have dedicated their lives to helping people, and we are the ones who have to keep fighting to bring some common sense to what's happening on the government level, but also to make sure that those people who truly feel voiceless, because many of them actually physically are voiceless, have a loud voice at the table.
Great. So I'm Roxanne Nava, and I'm the Executive Director at Metropolitan Family Services. I'm the Executive Director of the North Region. So North Region is the north side of the city, Evanston and Skokie. But I also have the honor of here representing Metropolitan Family Services as a whole. So as a whole, we're a 160-year-old organization. We serve 72,000 families on a yearly basis, 72,000 families and children on a yearly basis. We have over 20 locations, and when we talk about families, it's also our employees. And so when we think, and it's really an honor to serve our families, but when we think about the budget situation, it isn't just about the clients, it's about how do you keep high talent. Because to tell you a story where a couple hundred people are going to be let go, and all of a sudden it's like, well, maybe there might be, maybe. And people are thinking, am I going to make a mortgage payment? Am I going to be able to go to the doctor? You know, have food? It's our employees are thinking about all of that as well. And so you think, how do you keep that high talent, providing that high quality of service, serving our clients as well? Which is another strain, is that talent that's in the human service field is moving into different fields. And this budget situation has also made our organization, as many other nonprofit organizations, an involuntary lender. We are an involuntary lender to the state. And Comptroller Mendoza, we could certainly make better use of that $2 million a day that's spent on interest, as well as every single other organization that stands here today. Our charter is not to be an involuntary lender, but it's to empower families. And the reason I'm in our gear is because today we have a leadership retreat. And I left, and that's why I'm in our great gear of empowering families. And that is our motto, is really, in times of crisis, how do we empower our families so that they can earn, they can live, thrive, and really heal, and just be at a much better level in life. Thank you.
Mark Stutridge, President of Lutheran Social Service of Illinois. Good to be with you this afternoon. And we celebrate 150 years, so just 10 years following you as Metropolitan. And we're a statewide organization from Chicago, weaving our way down through Joliet, all the way into Marion and Cairo, and across to East St. Louis, back through the Quad Cities, Rockford, Peoria, in between, Champaign, different places. And we work with persons with disabilities, intellectual, developmental, and also those stemming from behavioral health, severe behavioral health issues, foster care and adoption, senior housing, home care. And all of this, prior to the impasse, was already going through significant change. I think it's important to note this, that we have a federal government that supports our state in the sense of many types of health and human service programs, and then we have general revenue funds that are either required to match those federal dollars in order, for instance, Medicaid to go forward, or in some cases, over the years, we've designed, I think appropriately so as a state, a system of human service that is funded through general revenue again. And when the impasse hit already, much of the general revenue funds and programs were already beginning to migrate as best they could into the benefit package of Medicaid, as an example. And many were just expiring. They would not even come back, for that matter. So when the impasse came, and all the general revenue fund programs that were supported could no longer be paid, and only court-ordered and consent decree programs could be paid, this really accelerated the problem. You know, accelerated the migration, accelerated the absence of service very quickly. And for us as an organization, it accelerated our cash flow issues, which were already present, and we already had some difficulty in the sense of delayed payment and payment from the state concerning general revenue funds to begin with. I met with the governor in August of 2015. We'd done our cash forecast, and I said, this goes to the end of the calendar year, we're going to be doing a major restructuring. I'm not talking about a little bit of something happening, but a major restructuring. And it ended up, because the impasse did not end, we, out of $106 million budget, we no longer served individuals that amounted to about $20 million in services. And we reduced our overhead by about 35%. And it amounted to approximately 43% of our workforce. We could no longer provide services that were not going to be paid. And that involved home care to seniors and mental health and substance abuse residential programs, and some reentry programs to returning citizens, former prisoners. We've since done a lot in our restructuring to monetize the assets that we have, to get our cash position in a better place. With the long-term effects, you can imagine, as we exited those programs, it exited in a way that would affect how we would move forward, you know, strategically in the best interest of individuals and persons and families, communities, and weakened our ability to move forward and to invest as we needed to, you know, in future service. That never stops as an organization. We can never stop thinking about tomorrow. We always have to think about it and how we're going to fund and support that.
Thank you. I'm going to get started with some questions. The first one is for Comptroller Mendoza. Can you tell us a little bit about, during the impasse, how was the state impacted financially, and how did we manage the backlog of bills?
Sure. So during the, just for a little reference on this, I took office in December. So I was elected in November, took office in December. When I took office, the bill backlog was about $9 billion. When Governor Rauner took office, the bill backlog was $5.03 billion when he was responsible for starting the process of his budget, right? So he inherited $5.03 billion, but over the course of the next 2 years, 2.5 years, that bill backlog more than tripled. What that means is that many people, everyone on that $15 billion plus bill backlog, became, as Roxanne mentioned, an unwilling lender to the state of Illinois. So anytime you hear the governor or anyone else say that we shouldn't be borrowing, I would say we shouldn't, but we already have, to the tune of $15.4 billion when it peaked, and these were unwilling lenders to the state of Illinois, and it's important that we pay them back for services already rendered. So this has been a big deal. So taking office during a $9 billion, which is now a $15 billion, I mean, it increased dramatically fast, was a difficult thing to manage when maybe we wake up one day and we have $15 million in our revenues, right? Like we literally have $15 million of tax revenues on any given day. Sometimes it's more than that, more often than not, but it's still not a lot of money. And we have a $15 billion bill backlog to contend with. So again, it goes back to that analogy of dealing with the most anemic breadstick you can imagine and just trying to keep people alive. So it didn't work with Lutheran Social Services. I came in after they had already downsized by 40% or more their employee base. But like this, every day that I've been controller, it's a matter of trying to keep someone alive, keep the lights on, or trying to prevent 100 people from losing their jobs. And so we have worked very well, I think, trying to keep the state from completely falling off the rails, the train, and being there to help people in their absolute moment of crisis. And it's not fair because every day for these social service providers is a moment of crisis. But there is crisis, and then there's catastrophe that they will not recover from, and they have to basically go under. We're trying to work with them through this crisis to triage. And triaging by definition means there's 3 groups, right? You have the groups that you can help right away and that, are gonna survive and be fine. You have those folks that you have to determine if we put resources into these folks, there's a chance that they'll survive. And then you have folks that no matter what you do, and no matter how many resources you throw at them, by now they are beyond the point of helping, right? They're gonna go under no matter what. And the Well Center is a perfect example of that. The Well Center in right south of Springfield, Taylorville, they, was it Jacksonville? Jacksonville, yeah, Jacksonville, I'm sorry, in Jacksonville. They should have been celebrating their 50th anniversary of service to the public in the area of substance abuse treatment. 50 years, it was their 49th year, going into their 50th. And instead of celebrating 50 years of service, they had to close their doors. And by the time I was controller and they made it public that they were in this dire situation, we did everything we could to help them. You know, I sat down with them. They said, okay, we'll be able to stay alive another 3 months, but if this budget doesn't get resolved, you know, it's not going to happen, we can't survive. And it ended up being that the budget was not resolved in time, and we had no other vouchers we could even pay them because there was no legal appropriation for me to pay for bills that weren't legally appropriated by the legislature. So whatever we had that we owed them, we were able to pay them to keep them alive a few more months, but that was it. And so it's infuriating when you think about, like, what can you do to help people? I can help triage them and be there in their worst moment of crisis to help try to keep the doors open or the lights on. But at some point, there's only so much that I can do. I have no more rabbits I can pull out of hats. And I've tried to do every magic trick available in terms of cash management to try to keep these folks going. But, you know, having a budget impasse for 2 years was devastating, not just for those 2 years, but for decades to come. Some of those folks will never recover. Like, they'll never be what they were before. There are people who literally are dying or have died as a result of this budget impasse. You can't tell me that if the next closest substance abuse provider is 150 or 200 miles away from Jacksonville, that a heroin addict is going to somehow find their way to a service that's 150 or 200 miles away. Like, the thing though, is that heroin addict doesn't go away. The problem still exists. Just the method for helping these people get their life back together and not end up in jail or in emergency rooms that are significantly more expensive to deal with the problem that way, those problems are going to be compounded versus our ability to invest in programs that help people on the front end so that we're not expending taxpayer dollars needlessly on the back end. And so I'll finish by saying this. I tell people, would you rather that the government, because lots of people will say to you on the issues, for example, of substance abuse, I don't want my tax dollars going to help a junkie, right? You hear it all the time. But I would say your tax dollars are going to deal with the issue of addiction, whether you want them to or not. But would you rather that the government take $1 out of your wallet when you're watching to help with a place like Jacksonville Well Center, or would you rather we take 14 when you're not? Because that's the difference between treating substance abuse on the front end or $14 more expensive at the correctional facility level, right? So I think one of the biggest eye-opening things for me as controller has been to actually, it's different than when I was in the legislature. It's different. We see parts of the budget, you have your issues that you care about, but you really don't dive into how every single dollar is being spent in the state of Illinois. But as a state's chief fiscal officer, I do. And it's eye-opening, and at times it's infuriating, and I think there's a story that needs to be told about how we can better invest the state's money for a much greater long-term investment versus just throwing good money behind bad money, behind bad issues or bad money, right? And that's something that I look forward to doing, and I'm going to stop talking because I could go on forever.
Thank you. So, Wendy, can you tell us a little bit more about the United Way's impact study that was put together during the impasse, and maybe share some findings that you think maybe would be relevant that we may not already know about?
Yeah. So as I said, we have spent the past 2 years we conducted 5 surveys over the years with our neutral, nonpartisan voice to document what's actually happened. It was actually our research through about 400 to 500 agencies each time we surveyed in all counties of the state that responded. That number of 1 million clients that fell out of service last year was actually something that we documented through our research. So 1 million people fell out of service. We know that's a drastic underestimate because that's just folks falling out of service. It's not folks dealing with reduced service. And that's just that agency population that I mentioned that we could reach around the state. It's actually much bigger. So we think that's actually a very, very lowball number. The last survey that we conducted, which was in March, what was reported back to us was that nearly half of the agencies that we were partnered with reduced the number of clients that they served, and about 25% closed programs. So just take a minute and wrap your head around that. So we generally fund very, very strong, fiscally strong agencies. Half of them had to reduce the people that they're reaching, and 25% of them closed programs. To what the comptroller just said, I will say, and it was a comment I said in the very beginning, these programs have ROI. Spending money on these programs, and we know research documents these ROIs, and the cuts, we also put our arms around where the cuts went, and it would surprise you where they were experienced, because these are some of the things that we know have the highest ROIs of anything you could possibly invest in, such as employment training, youth development, mental health services, housing, shelter, and criminal justice programs. Those were all the areas actually that lost the most resources in this triage that we're talking about. And so we wonder why we have community challenges, given what I just said. My fellow panelists, and we fund some of the great agencies on this panel, they can speak to very specific things, but I can give you some very specific stories that kind of paint it. Sort of the overarching picture. According to the Chicago Foundation for Women, last year close to 4,000 adults and 4,000 kids that were seeking shelter for domestic violence were turned away. We saw intake waiting lists for victims of rape and sexual assault climb up to 12 weeks just for intake. We saw Meals on Wheels type programs all over the region, in the Chicago region, reduce the number of visits that they provide to seniors. Those are meals that seniors rely on each day to be fed. And of course we know that the Tribune published that there were long waiting lists for women to receive screenings for cancers who were already exhibiting symptoms. But what I really want to say is, and it goes back to what I said at the very beginning, it's not just that we didn't have a budget for 18 months and then we had a stopgap. It goes back to rationalization, what I actually called was a receding of the funding. So putting numbers around that, if you compare what the state funds now to just what it funded 8 years ago for human services, it's about 1/3 less that we are dealing with as a state in terms of funding for human services. And I think this explains a lot of why we are seeing so many challenges in income, education, health, and safety in our communities, certainly in the Chicago metropolitan area, but around the state.
So we know that some sort of resolution came about in early July, right? Mark and Roxanne, can you give us some initial thoughts of what it was like in early July after the budget was finally passed? How were your supporters feeling? Did you expect that payments would come swiftly? What were the feelings that were coming about in those early days after the budget passed in July?
Well, actually, our giving from contributors, which were mostly Lutheran in our world, went up. And they were very supportive and very sympathetic, in some cases empathetic, to the changes that we were going through. And we were very transparent about this. And of course, we were in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, a number of issues. So we couldn't hide what we were doing very well. We didn't want to, but we were very clear about the effects, and our supporters came through for us. I think that the issue, as I mentioned before, is that it just accelerates the already poor financial performance and condition that most not-for-profits like ours in human service are in, from a cash position and from a revenue perspective, because the impasse is kind of like the thing that really killed us. Things that were going on long before that, had been slowly nicking away at the health of human services and health of human services. And now, what happens is that there are some exciting things happening in the sense of 1115 waiver with the state and thinking through reform of child welfare. Some very good thinking and some good plans happening. But for us as a nonprofit organization, where do we come up with the cash to invest in that innovation? when we do a state contract, we're not paid for innovation. We're not paid to close programs or any of the tail costs. We're just paid for the fee for the service at the time that we deliver. And as we look forward and we begin to invest, and these are costly investments to innovate toward, greater outcomes and greater performance, it's left us in a position where we're struggling to come up with that cash and to invest in that future.
Thank you. So at Metropolitan Family Services, once the budget passed, there are a couple things that happened. On one hand, we do it, one of the things that Comptroller Mendoza talked about is how do you make all of these bills that were passed due? And we appreciated the fact that domestic violence had not been paid through that time. And we did make a deliberate decision to keep providing those services despite not being paid as an involuntary lender. We did, so we appreciated that payment. Thank you. But as Comptroller Mendoza said, we got partial payment. And the passing of the budget meant we were able to open up programs where we had lost programs in the past of serving almost 1,000 families through this time, that we had to close programs and let staff go. And it had an immediate impact on 1,000 families, but those 1,000 individuals are part of a bigger family that we were serving. So there's another rippling effect that happens there. We are going to be able to restore programs, but restoring programs also means restoring confidence in the staff that provide those programs and saying, can you hang with us or come to us for another year and provide these services? With that said, we still believe it is important to hold the state accountable for paying for services that have been delivered and are still owed. So that is an important factor, that it is really important. We do believe hold the state accountable for services rendered, services promised, and we're still owed those services. And we continue to provide that services. We are, 40% of our budget does come from private, either from foundations or donations. And that's how we're able to be fiscally sound. But despite that, every dollar matters, just like every human being matters. And some of the budget did also mean we're able to bring on more early prevention programs for children. So to Comptroller Mendoza's point, and Mark's and everybody else's point, is it isn't just about the people in crisis, but really catching people before they get to that point, as the triage analogy was mentioned, is, there are people right at the edge, but for all of our collective intervention, we can get people on a much better path.
Thank you. So Andrea, can you tell us a little bit more about the group and those you represent? How are you all dealing with the cuts that have been made to services in the new budget?
So the Pay Now Illinois Coalition is not active anymore because the lawsuit is over. But what we saw was that the cuts, and I hesitate to call them, well, there's cuts in the fiscal 18 budget. Honestly, providers have the cuts. Having knowledge and being able to plan makes a big difference. So knowing what the cuts are and having there be transparency, if you know there's a 5% cut, you can plan your workforce, you can assess your cash position, you can think, you can think and be planful. It's actually, I'm not going to say cuts are better, but the situation is better than being in the budget impasse where we had total uncertainty, because it's impossible to plan when you don't have any knowledge of whether you'll be paid, when you'll be paid, how much you'll be paid. So I think, and if you'll be paid, exactly. So I guess the big question for us right now is this a truce? Are we going to do this again in 2019? I don't know. And I think we're all kind of holding our breath about that. Is like, do we really have a budget now just till June 30? Or are we going to go through this rigmarole again? And one of the questions and the things that we're looking at very closely as a coalition is what kind of reforms or legislation do we want to put forward to try to protect providers from being in this place again? Because I want to be clear, what happened to us wasn't accidental. We weren't collateral damage. We were the weapon, you know?
You're right.
So moving along, Comptroller Mendoza, can you explain what this budget does to help pay down the backlog? And then also, can you address Governor Browner's announcement to borrow $6 billion in bonds? How will that help
Sure.
improve the situation?
That's a great question. So the budget itself did nothing to help me pay down the bill backlog, which was about 15 and a half at some point. Right now it's about 15.3. Nothing to do, not a penny really goes towards that, because the budget in and of itself, while it was incredibly important and I'm very thankful that we have one, what it did was it helped to stem the bleeding of deficit spending that was happening over the last 2.5 years. So this government, just over the last 2 years, even the last year to be exact, the last 12 months, was deficit spending at the tune of about $600 million a month, right? You hear the administration say that, you know, they don't like to spend. Well, they were overspending any other prior administration at the tune of $600 million a month. So in effect, they were continuing to, without a state budget, enter into contracts with folks with no appropriation for those contracts. They were, I was having to pay billions of dollars worth of bills in relation to court-ordered payments, to continuing appropriations that are by statute. There's a core of debt service obligations that we cannot ever default on. As much as people might not like banks, the minute we default on paying the banks for the money that they've loaned us, we will never ever qualify for a loan ever again. And so that would hurt the very people that we're trying to help by accessing capital to be able to pay down some of these bills. So when I look at how the bills go out the door in terms of the payments, you know, dealing with this backlog, you have to pay the debt service, you really have to pay the pension payments, because if you skip on those, they downgrade your credit rating. There's so many things that you have to balance. Education payments, K through 12, general state aid payments are always made on time, because those things also impact the governance. I mean, can you imagine, had we not resolved this education issue, it's not just an issue of kids not having a school to go to, it's an issue that would devastate the business community, because those kids have parents and lots of them have jobs, and they would have to figure out whether they're staying home because there's no school for their child or going to work, right? So it's a domino effect on any decision that the government takes that is anything other than let's pay our bills as quickly as possible. But again, to the point of, you know, the $6 billion, we have $15 billion right now, a little bit more than that, that has to be paid back. Not all of it is eligible for late payment interest penalties, which is another travesty of this, right? So when we talk about, you heard me say we owe over $900 million to people who didn't want to lend us money to begin with, right, in interest payments. But not a single one of those people who are going to collect interest, which they deserve, frankly, for us not paying our bills on time, are sitting at this table or represent people that these folks represent. None of the social service providers get a penny in late payment interest penalties. Yet they, just like the people that do get up to 12% interest, have been unwilling lenders. So think about that. It's like, it's bad enough as it is that we're not paying them on time, but most of those folks are not in a position where they can withstand even a 3-month budget impasse, much less a 2-year budget impasse, which is why you see a lot of them close their doors. So I've been screaming from the top of my lungs that one of the things that the budget did do, besides that they did increase, you know, well, let me start back again. I'm sorry, this is such a long answer, but the $600 million, why were we spending $600 million a month more than we had? Because this administration continued to enter into contracts and to spend money as if the income tax that had expired was still in place. So, you know, it would have been okay to say, let's get rid of the income tax if you instituted cuts that reflected the loss of that $5 billion in revenue on an annual basis. But the governor didn't institute any cuts. He didn't introduce a budget that had a combination of cuts and maybe a lower increase in the income tax. Or he could have introduced just an increase in the income tax to make up for the $5 billion, or what, a combination thereof. But because none of those things happened and we went 2 years without a budget, the state continued to spend as if that $5 billion was coming in every year. So not only were we immediately operating at a $5 billion deficit, they entered into additional contracts above and beyond what we had done in the prior budget year, and we were deficit spending at $600 million a month. This is where the budget comes in. They increased taxes, so that's going to generate about $5 billion. They did about $3 billion worth of cuts to existing, expenditures. That $7.5 to $8 billion helps to basically level off the deficit spending that was happening over the last year, but it does nothing to pay down the bill backlog, which is why I've been saying, thank the Lord that the legislature passed an authorization for the governor to go to the market and try to sell up to $6 billion worth of bonds. Now again, he has said, I don't want to do that because that's borrowing, and the state doesn't know how to control its spending, which is so ironic if you consider the source. But even if you put that aside, it does not make any fiscal sense, like none, zero, regardless of what party you're in, to continue to pay 12% interest on debts already incurred when you could be paying between 4 and 6 in a worst case scenario, right? Any person with any level of common sense, let's say you have a home mortgage and you're paying 12% on that. If you can get 6% or 4% or 5%, you'd be crazy not to. You'd immediately go to do that, right? So it's not the same because you're not talking about a mortgage per se, but the concept of refinancing expensive debt at a much lower rate is exactly the same, right? So, in your case, it might save you a few $100,000 over the course of the entire mortgage loan period. In the state's case, it's millions of dollars a day that we would be saving, and over the 12-year period of this bond deal, we'd be saving between $6 to $8 billion by doing the deal. If you don't do the deal, it's going to cost the state an additional $6 to $8 billion a year. So this is just common sense. And I've been talking about this from the minute they passed the budget because it was a really necessary tool to begin to legitimately pay down that bill backlog. Now, even if we leverage $6 billion, I can turn maybe $1 or $2 billion of that into matching payments on Medicaid payments and get a 2-for-1 hit, start to pay down a lot of the service providers who have been owed money for an incredibly long time, an unjustly long time, frankly, but make a dent. It's not going to be all 15. It's going to take time to pay down that $15 billion. But wouldn't you rather have me be able to pay $6 to $8 billion down of that right away, if not more, right? This is just common sense. So that's what the budget does. Now that the governor, 61 days later, at the cost of $122 million, finally said, yes, I'm going to do this, I will say thank you for doing what he should have done on day one. And I'm glad, regardless. It's water under the bridge. We've got to move forward. I look forward to working with him, as does the state treasurer, and I'm sure the AG, in getting the deal done and allowing me to finally begin to start paying some serious bills down as quickly as possible and to take a lot of that 12% debt that is, accruing off the books. Get people within a more reasonable time period of paying their bills. They're still going to be delayed significantly, everybody, no matter who they are. But there's a big difference between, even a 4-month delay to a 14-month delay, which is the case for many people, if not more. So it has to be done. There are some good things in this budget, but this is going to be a crisis that is going to take years to get out of. And it will have lasting, damaging impact on millions of people. Like you said, it's not just the 1 million people that legitimately are out of the services, but we're going to end up paying for the fact that those people aren't getting mental health services or substance abuse treatment services or early childhood education, right? You're either going to educate or incarcerate. There's so many things that we're going to miss out on lost opportunity costs because of our inability to act like adults and get the job done. But it's never too late. So this is a step in the right direction, but there's many more that have to follow. Andrew, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yes, I wanted to just add to what the comptroller said about the prompt payment interest. So many social service providers are excluded from benefiting from the prompt payment interest act as it stands. And the governor just recently vetoed a bill that was passed by both chambers to include us in the prompt payment act. But But what's challenging, and I think Mark mentioned, that his donors had come through. It's very difficult to say, let's have a gala to pay our bank fees, or let's fundraise. Please give us money, United Way, so we can shut down this program, right? Like the philanthropy isn't going to make up the difference here to cover these costs of doing business with the state. And unfortunately, the lack of being owed prompt payment interest could provide a perverse incentive to put human service providers at the back of the line, because we continue to be the unwilling lender, and it's on each individual board of directors to figure out how to raise that money and cover that cost, and the state doesn't feel that pressure to pay us, so it's really a terrible catch-22 situation and a huge inequity in our contracting environment.
Wendy, I know you had a few more
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that, let me just take this and run with it. How sexy is it to go to private philanthropists and say, will you give a gift to backfill what the government should be funding but isn't funding? Okay, that's just DOA, right? And, this was a point, I'll make it now. We're in a situation where this should be a philanthropy really, should be a public-private partnership. Philanthropy really should be funding to innovate and to really test out new things and take our social services and our arts and our culture to the next level. And what's going on in the state of Illinois is that philanthropy, the attempt is that philanthropy is getting pulled in to pay for public services. Now, I will tell you, that's not going to work either, because if you look at the whole pie of funding for human services, just for example, the philanthropic piece, the private funding piece, is a very small minority of it, so the math just doesn't even work. But I do think there's a lot of people out there who think, oh, private philanthropy can just kind of step in and pick up the tab. No, we're the largest private funder of human services. That won't happen. And we can't go to our donors and say, that's the worst, that is a non-starter, XYZ company. Would you like to pay for what the government has been paying for that really should be a public service? No. So we need our partner back.
Can I add one thing, Wendy? I think that people kind of lose focus on the fact that all of these social service providers are saved, if they are functioning, if they're actually providing the services that we're asking them to provide, are doing so at such a lower cost than it would take the state of Illinois to actually have to provide those services, right? So somehow that just common sense factoid gets lost in this whole argument, which is why I'm trying to, kind of talk about this so much, because you guys are doing us a favor. It's not the other way around. When people think that the state is spending too much on social service providers, then the only option is for us to spend more to do a worse job of providing services to people. It doesn't make any sense, but it's kind of like an argument that I really haven't heard that many people make. They are saving the state of Illinois money by providing services on our behalf in a much more professional way than the state could ever do. Already, the state of Illinois has less employees. As much as people say, well, just cut the bloat, we already have less employees compared to any other state of our size. It's not even close. So, there's always room for further additional cuts, but what these folks provide to the state is actually saving us money. So for every one of them that closes, for every program that goes under, we still are going to end up paying for it one way or another. It's just going to be way more expensive, and we're not even good at it.
Well, and in this budget impasse, we didn't do it in a planful way. The people who were making the decisions to close programs were boards of directors, and they were looking at just the impact on their organization and maybe their community and what they could do. It wasn't like we decided as a state, oh, let's not fund this, let's fund that instead. This was not a rational policy conversation about how do we ration the state's precious public dollars. This was, the rationing was all put on the executive directors and the governance of these organizations. I was talking to one of our plaintiffs, a domestic violence provider downstate. This is the only shelter of its kind in Champaign. It was the only shelter of its kind in 4-county area, and they were literally resorting to having bake sales to keep open. And she said to me, I know we have several women in our shelter right now who've been strangled or throttled. And if I send them home, 700 times more likely to die. Not just that they're maybe going to, but like 700 times more likely to die. And so I'm gonna have another bake sale to keep this place open, because if I don't, I know I'm sending someone to their death. And that's the kind of decision that the state put on providers. We didn't sign up to make those kinds of life or death decisions, you know? We signed contracts to do work.
To save people's lives.
To save people's lives. And so to put that kind of, you know, pressure on people without having any sort of plan or discussion about, well, what's the safety net if we shut this down over here, who's going to pick it up over there? None of that happened. And so we're still, that recovery is going to take a long time, because shelters closed, homeless shelters closed, you know, lots of programs shut down. 25% of, you know, your respondents, you said, shut down programs, and the impact will be felt for a long time.
Yeah, for sure, indeed. So to be cognizant of time, I'd like to open up to questions from the audience. Before we do that, I wanted to check in with Roxanne and Mark if you had any quick remarks you wanted to make before we get into questions.
One comment I would make is that I was appreciative of the stopgap. I was appreciative of the budget being passed, and I'm appreciative of the restructuring efforts of the debt so that we can get, you know, cash flow in a much more meaningful way and smart way. At the same time, we don't have a sustainable budget over the long term. It's not happening. So, I mean, I know that, most people understand that, but it just puts pressure, you know, back onto government and private providers in a way that what I see is that through history, our policy then is shaped by lawsuits, consent decrees, and federal court orders. You want your state human service system to be shaped by, you know, federal courts and lawsuits and consent decrees, because that's what's happening. Even when it influences the development of a waiver process with the feds. So we've got to get out from underneath this and get some breathing room so that we can begin to have great policy and planning and do what's right. And then the other thing I would say is that hidden to most people, we've got a big new payer out there. They're called managed care organizations. And if we thought that the state was difficult to get payment from, my goodness, you know, we've got a bunch of hoops. We've invested over $1 million in infrastructure just to begin the process of billing and electronic health records and the necessary stuff that's needed in order to do business with them. So that's another hidden part of this as well.
One of the things that often people ask is, you know, how do you feel as a nonprofit making comments, you know, because these are, you know, the question Andrea said, like, is this a political or is this a legal? And one of the things that we want to make really clear is that it's an honor to stand for all the families that we serve. So there's nothing to be shy about, and it is important that we be strong advocates, not only as individuals, but as a collective team. So that has been one big benefit of the crisis, is it is very clear that nonprofits are working a lot closer together as a group instead of siloing, where it's more of a referral basis, and we are collectively a much stronger advocacy group. And our clients are involved in that advocacy, where it is about holding every person and everyone accountable for what their role is. You know, everybody who goes to Springfield, it isn't just like really 2 people or 3 people, it's everybody. It's everybody, and making sure that people are aware of the actions that everyone is taking. And it is important that we do continue the work, because I think it is so like eminently, like crystal clear. The problems, the challenges of life don't go away. They just get exponentially bigger. And so we can't turn a blind eye to that. In Spanish, it's a saying, it's called, you know, people want to call it tapar un sol con un dedo. It's like you want to cover up the sun with a finger. Like, maybe if you cover it up. No, it's there. It's not going away. Like, you're not a little bit pregnant, you're pregnant. It's not a little lie, it's a lie. You promised to pay me, you didn't. You know, people don't have a little problem. It's a challenge. You know, we're not, and the way we deliver service isn't a meet and greet. It's integrated service that we provide. It isn't just about, hey, how you doing? You're great? Okay, great. There you go. That's not how we deliver service, and our commitment is to continue providing that integrated service to everybody that we serve.
Thank you. Let's open it up for questions in the audience. How about this woman here in the pink?
This is to Comptroller Mendoza. Comptroller Mendoza. Did you find any evidence that Ronner personally gained or his political action committees gained from this debt crisis that he drove us into? I believe that that's why he did it.
I think a lot of people feel that, you know, by his own words, back to 2013, he said that if he was given the opportunity to shut down government, even for a little while, this is an exact quote, he would do it. We came very close to a government shutdown. Were it not for those 10 Republicans who did the right thing and chose to save the state versus their party, many of them have already announced their resignations because they knew that it would cost them potentially their next election through a well-funded primary opponent. You see a few of the ones who have not announced their resignation now have primary opponents who are being funded by their own party. It used to be back in the day that the Republicans worried about their general election, not their primary. They're worried about their primaries now more than their general election, right? So, I don't know. I mean, clearly the governor's made it very clear where he stands on what his goal was, in my opinion, to shut down government. Blame everybody else for it, but he's the one who was deficit spending at the tune of $600 million. That doesn't happen by whether it's the Speaker or the Senate President or a Democratic or Republican legislature. That's the governor who oversees those state agencies and who, you know, it's his #1 core responsibility per the state constitution, regardless of if you're a Democratic or a Republican governor, to, per the Constitution, introduce a balanced budget proposal. Now, they never end up being the proposal that makes it to the end of the day, right? But that's at least your #1 and most important duty as governors, to introduce a balanced budget proposal. Now, you then take it from there and negotiate with the legislature. But as I say, that's Article 8, Section 2A, not B and not C. A is the governor leads, B, the legislature that appropriates funds and works out a deal with him, and C, you know, we have a budget, right? But the controller can't pay the bills if there's no budget that gives me legal authority. The courts basically took over the job of the General Assembly over the last 2 years and decided what bills I have to pay and left me very little room to negotiate. And per the governor's own words, he felt that if you drive a wedge between organized labor and social service providers, he would be able to pass things like term limits or redistricting or whatever other stuff, you know, would break organized labor and, you know, bring more of his one-party rule mentality into office. So I'm not a huge fan. I don't think that's a secret. And I know that this is not a political forum. I get it. But I do think that it's really scary what you see happening in Springfield right now. And the people who have been most impacted are, again, the reason why government should exist, the most vulnerable people amongst us. So I take offense to that. And I'm speaking out about it every day. I feel like, you know, I'm often fighting out of my weight class, right? But I was sent here not to sit behind a desk and just crunch numbers, because I don't believe that that $15 billion is just a number on a spreadsheet. They have faces, and I've met many of the victims of that $15 billion budget impasse, and they have names, and they have stories, and they have families who deserve the state of Illinois to be fighting for them and working for them. And so any chance I get to actually put a face on that impasse, it's not just a number in a spreadsheet. It really matters. These are people, and I believe that investing in people is not just the morally correct thing to do, it's the fiscally sound thing to do. And as the state's chief fiscal officer, that's important. And one other thing I want to kind of add to that, like, why would you...
Talking about corruption, you know, anything that we can prosecute.
Well, clearly I'm not the U.S. attorney, right? I think that you need to be able to connect the dots, and that's, you know, not my job to do. My job is to be transparent with the state's fundings, and that's what I was going to add to that. I have a bill called the Debt Transparency Act that passed both chambers, that Democrats and some Republicans, you know, given the political climate right now, it's amazing that people would vote for a bill that I passed, but it's that good of a transparency bill, and it would allow my office to actually see what the true cost of the state's debt is. Because right now, the number that I gave you, 15.3, it's only our best estimate, and it's based on the vouchers that we have in hand that are waiting to be paid, many of these folks here. But if, for example, Andrea calls me on behalf of a certain social service group and says, hey, you guys owe us $2 million, I might only be sitting on $100,000 worth of vouchers in the controller's office. And I have no idea where the other, you know, $1,900 or $1.9 million are. Why? Because the state agencies don't have a legal obligation to make that information public to me as the state's checkbook keeper. Does that make any sense? Everyone in this room, I would assume, balances their checkbook more than once a year. Right now, the state of Illinois is only required to give me, you're laughing, so okay, at least do it. At least do it 10 times, all right? But my point is, most people in any business that is successful has to balance their checkbook routinely. You know, once a week or once every month at the worst. So the state of Illinois, I only get that information once a year. It's given to me by the state agencies in a lump sum number, and it gives me no transparency or clarity. It just says, this is the liability, and I get it in October, and it's only current as of June, so by the time I get it, it's already way late. And I think that I should have clarity on what the debt is on a monthly basis, and not only know what the lump sum is, but what are the bills that are owed and to whom, and are they collecting 9% interest or 12% interest? Because my job is to manage cash flow, and I need to know which are the bills that need to be paid off the most because they're the most expensive, or which are the critical need bills that will keep a business open. This is all going to allow me to do a better job for you, because at the end of the day, it's not my money, it's your money, and you deserve to know where it's locked up in the system. And I think that taxpayers deserve to know, are we on the hook for $900 million, which I think is a low estimate right now, on late payment interest penalties, or what is the actual cost? We can't fix the problem if we don't truly know what it even is, and that's what we're pushing for. And that will give us a lot of information on, you know, why things are being held up and who's not getting paid and who's making a lot of interest that we may not know today.
So, really quickly before we get to our next question, Wendy, do you? Okay, so a question from the middle. Woman in the gray in the middle.
I have two questions. Oh, wait. I have two questions. One, all of you have talked about the impact of the budget problem on the people you serve, but none of you have talked about another impact on the people you've let go. There's been a loss of talent, expertise, and institutional history. And so my one question related to the people who have been let go, fired, whatever you terminated, have they left the public sector because they had no choice? And secondly, all of you have described the problem, the crisis, very well. What is the solution to that problem other than having a budget? Do we need additional revenue beyond the tax increase that was passed? Do we need a progressive income tax by amending the Constitution? What are at least one solution to all of this?
So I could take a bit of a workforce issue. This is something that ICOI has been working on for a while now, and you're absolutely right. This has had a huge impact on the human services workforce. It's not only have we had to let go very talented people, but we've also, it makes it difficult to recruit people in. We've got a real challenge here in terms of the contract levels prohibiting being able to pay in many ways a competitive wage. And that translates into challenges in service too. When you have great employee turnover, it becomes difficult to achieve the kind of programmatic outcomes that we're hired to achieve in the first place. So the impact on the workforce is tremendous. You asked, are people leaving the field? You know, anecdotally, we have been hearing about people leaving sometimes for other professions, sometimes leaving the state, and sometimes going into other angles of human service work. Maybe they're leaving community-based human services and they're going to work for hospitals or healthcare systems or things like that, where it's less volatile, but we lose that community knowledge. We lose those connections to the community. It's a real challenge. I've heard of people, one of my plaintiffs, one of my providers in Southern Illinois was trying to hire a licensed clinical social worker. For 4 months they had this job open, and they finally offered it to someone, and the person said, I've decided to be a plumber. And while none of us call our plumbers for family therapy, that's not the place you look, right? But here's somebody who's, to be a licensed clinical social worker, you've had a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, 2 years post-master's at work, you've had supervision, continuing education. It's a huge investment in a person's human potential. And to set that aside, and when you need a plumber, you need a plumber. I'm not talking down about plumbers, but it is a real loss to our profession when somebody who's put that kind of time and effort in their career turns away from it. So I'm sure that Roxanne or Mark may have other.
So I'm going to give you a story. We had one of the city agencies come in and really do a site visit at one of our locations, and they were shocked to see licensed professionals in the delivering mental health services. Why are you shocked? He goes, well, other agencies have had to resort to interns providing the service because you can't afford this. You can't afford the talent that ideally the agency would like to have. And it isn't just affording, it's really attracting. And so on one hand, so we did, I think it's, we talked about like having to lose that high quality talent. Very hard to retain them, and it is a common story that we face where we finally find the right person after having a position open. They agree to it, and they say, oh, I'm sorry, I found a different job. And it's in a totally different field. But then on the flip side, it's also a lot more work for our staff. Part of having a licensed team, the kind of talent that we have, the caseloads have exponentially grown, and that is not healthy. That is not a good, healthy environment for anybody involved. And so that's something that we monitor, and we don't want to say no, but we need to provide a healthy environment for everybody that's involved. And I will tell you, we have a highly committed and passionate staff where they want to keep, another example of our domestic violence, there's a big waiting list. And a lot of people that provide domestic violence service, just using that one as an example, after 8 visits, the client is cut off. 8 visits. A lot of people that provide that, we don't. And there's a big waiting list. One of the grammar schools that we work with, a grammar school that we provide academic and social emotional learning and enrichment. It's called our Community Schools Program. When I met with the principal said, I could easily, because of the challenges our families are facing, there's no buffer between the parent and the child. It's really like the family takes on what's happening. And she said, it is so challenging, grammar school, said, I could easily call, and I do call, for our mental health services to institutionalize 2 kids a week, she told me. And she goes, but they're on a waiting list, and a lot of things happen while those kids are on a waiting list. A lot of things happen. So this isn't like you think it's them or that. No, this is every day, all the time. So and that takes an emotional toll also on our staff, because I would say we all have a really highly committed team who don't like you want to end those stories, and they look for everything that they can to help that. So it is a toll on everybody involved. Everybody.
I think we have time for one last question. Anyone over here in this section?
The solution.
I think we have to move forward. I apologize. One last question.
I'm for a progressive income tax, so let's start with that.
Gentleman over here, last question.
Hi, I'm just wondering, because I graduated recently from IIT, and one thing I noticed about my generation is that they're not, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but they're not too much into these kind of issues that much. They don't care about it. So, I mean, part of the reason I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is because of the way the the mainstream media covers it a little bit. So how do you feel about how the media has covered it? Do you think they did a good job or not? If they did do a good job, who do you, like, which outlets do you think did good on this?
So one of the things that I thought was really fascinating about this budget impasse was the media coverage and the message. And when the budget impasse started, we started talking a lot about the human toll and the potential of the human toll and the actual human toll, whether it's jobs lost or the impact on communities and families for loss of services. And what we found was pretty quickly, when you start down this road, you get into a conversation, a public conversation about whether or not the recipients of our services are worthy, okay? So you hear things like, people shouldn't have children if they can't take care of them, or it's not my fault that they are an addict, you know, that kind of conversation. What we learned with the lawsuit was we reframed that and we started talking about that we had contracts, we did the work, we should be paid. And talking about contracts was universally uncontroversial. The statement that I just said is a very conservative statement and everyone agreed with it. And what you see is the media coverage we got exploded. If you go to, we tried to be very transparent with the lawsuit, and we created a website called paynowillinois.org that has all the legal filings on it, but it also has as much of the media coverage as we could gather. And when you look at that and you scroll down, in a 12-month period, we had literally hundreds and hundreds of stories written about the unfairness of people not getting their contracts paid. What nobody rarely asked about us about was what was the work we were doing. You know, so what I find is that you asked who. I don't think this is the fault of the media. I think it's the resonance of what people care about and how sort of people's fundamental beliefs. And so one thing that's non-controversial is that people believe in our economy that if you have a contract and you did the work, you should be paid. We don't have a consensus as a society about whether it's worthwhile to care for people who are sick or poor who need our assistance. And that's a real challenge. That's not just your generation that faces it. This has been this is an eternal, literally you can go back hundreds and hundreds of years to poor laws to see, people deciding who's worthy and who's not worthy of being supported.
I would just add that and say, I agree with all those points. I will point out something that I think is hopeful. I think it was a lot of people actually across the state that came together to make sure that this budget did pass. A lot of factions that crossed labor, social services, the corporate community, and Republicans who wanted to see this budget passed. And that's really hopeful, right? That's a lot of citizens from a lot of different points of view coming together and saying, this has gone too far. But I do think, I think the media has been covering this. I think the media did some really interesting things right before the stopgap to actually, align the headlines of papers across the state about what was going on, which I think actually created a media push to enact the stopgap. But I think it's really a public education and public awareness piece. That's where I said we started with as United Way was. We wanted to educate the public on documenting what's going on so that people, everyday people, realize how this is affecting them. Their own needs, their neighbors' needs, as I said, our economy, because how is our economy really going to grow? How are we going to be invested in as a state if we don't have a good reputation, if we don't have a good workforce here? And so I think what has to happen is a massive public education and awareness campaign.
And I would just add that I don't believe that constituency pressure brought about the budget. Didn't do it. Most people are disengaged from this. If you're working as a 30-something in a corporate world and your bonus is coming in, your company's doing great, you don't even think about this. Budget impasse, what's going on? It's not happening. What happened is special interest groups and the fact the government is about to shut down, it finally got to the point to where, we've got to pass this. There's no way around it. So that's a sad commentary, but that's a reality, I think.
I did a video on the eve of the budget vote that I thought maybe just a few people on Facebook would watch that kind of broke down what was happening and that I'd already spoken about what would be the consequences of no budget come the deadline, right, which was June 30th. that come August, we were going to default on pension payments, on state payrolls. This is for the first time would be happening in our state. Like our core obligations that have never not been made were going to not be made for the first time in August. And that it would only get worse in October and November. That literally we were going to shut down, that it was not a false alarm. And the legislators, I think, finally also understood, like, we're not lying, the math is the math. Like, we are literally going to shut down, and Illinois will be the first state in the nation to be put into junk bond status officially. Like, these things finally got to a head. It had been managed to, like, triage through, but come August, we were done. So they really had to get it done. That video that I didn't think anyone would watch got 2.5 million views in 2 days. Like, it was a 6-minute video. It's like, I thought, who's gonna watch this? But people watched it, and that's not why we have a budget. But my point is that what really angered me is that that week, that's when the lotto stopped selling tickets. You remember that? The lotto stopped on the eve of that vote. And I thought, how on earth is it that we have grown so numb to what is happening with this universe of people? So numb that people just went on with their lives. It was like, okay, yeah, that child was gonna have their oxygen tank ripped away, but you know, whatever. Happens every day. It's not supposed to ever happen. But God forbid you not be able to buy your lotto ticket. It was like the greatest crisis in Illinois. So I think, you know, the fact that this budget thing, when Lutheran Social Services lost, you know, a big chunk of what you were doing, everybody paid attention. That was like the first moment that it was like, whoa, this budget impasse is real. But then it started happening every day. And all of a sudden, people became numb to it. They grew indifferent. And that is like the worst possible crisis that can happen. So thankfully, we have now moved beyond that, but there's still a long way to go. And you're right, when it's really unfortunate that people can support this concept of like, well, you shouldn't violate a contract more than the concept of we should be caring for the most vulnerable. But it is what it is, and so good job on framing it in whatever way makes movement happen.
So we are at the end of our time together for this session. I think it goes without saying that these long-term impacts and effects from the state budget impasse will continue for years to come, and that we need to keep fighting the good fight. So please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you, Anita. We'll start our third session very soon. If you're staying for the third session, I'm going to ask that you sit in the middle. So move your stuff and we'll all get cozy. Thank you all so much for coming.